I'm Deborah. I wanted the topic of my first video to be red pilling, but I saw in the news that one Hulk Hogan had died. And being a wrestling fan for a good portion of my life, like I was, I thought it would be interesting to talk about it. And for me, anyway, being a wrestling fan was the biggest mistake of my life. If not the biggest mistake of my life, was being a professional wrestling fan for as long as I was. Because wrestling is not a good business. In my opinion, it's not a good thing to be a fan of. I grew up in the Stampede wrestling territory. And this is something that I think that you would have to have a knowledge of the history of pro wrestling and a knowledge of how, wrestling really worked until it was a couple of big companies. But when I grew up with Stampede Wrestling, I grew up very, very close to the ring. And what I mean is I grew up very, very close, to the ring when I went. And so I had no, you know, I had no illusions what wrestling really was. Now for me, anyway, it was part of my life. It was um, entertainment. It was something that my mom would take me to. It was something that would be a part of your life if you watch TV on a Saturday afternoon or something like that. But I had no illusions about what it really was, and so for the better part of my life, I could not believe in any of the hype surrounding Hulk Hogan. I could not believe about anything about his character, his real American character. Praise, say your prayers, take your vitamins, all of that stuff. Be a real American. Being a Canadian, that really didn't matter to me. And so, I mean, I never actually bought into it. I actually only wanted from Hulk Hogan what he could offer as a wrestler, specifically because I knew what good professional wrestling was, that it looked real, it sounded real, but you knew it wasn't real. And growing up, like in the, Stampede Wrestling, a lot of what, I saw was booked by Stu Hart. And he had a really high bar for a sort of very realistic kind of wrestling style. And so if Hulk Hogan wasn't someone who could live up to, kind of being a hard hitting pro wrestler, I just didn't want anything to do with him. And so over time, as much as, like the WWF at the time wanted you to believe in it, I couldn't. And over time, when you would read in pro wrestling magazines or you would read in The Observer or something like that about who Hulk Hogan really was, it didn't surprise me. When I first heard Jesse Ventura say that Hulk Hogan prevented wrestlers from having a union, Hulk Hogan in real life was not necessarily a good person. Seeing him become, the villain in WCW seemed to fit. But then again, you always knew in the back of your mind that this was just something he knew he had to do because of how everyone felt about it. So because it was the 1990s and whatnot, it was the thing to do to be an anti-hero and to be someone who looked like a villain, acted like a villain, but someone who still sold a lot of merchandise, and people still showed up to see and everything. Because pro wrestling is just something that over the years I've lost a lot of respect for. I really felt a good deal of schadenfreude that a lot of people would talk about the fact that they thought that Hulk Hogan was one thing, but he turned out to be another. I had no sympathy for that. And I kind of feel as if people who are like that don't necessarily have a good grip on what pro wrestling really was, or what it's supposed to be, or what it was in the beginning. So I I just can't get into the idea of saying that because, Hulk Hogan was the greatest pro wrestler of all time, but I can't get into that because he wasn't. He was certainly someone who could give the illusion he was the greatest professional wrestler of all time. I certainly think that pro wrestling should not be in the position it's in right now. And even now, it's nowhere near the success it had in the 1990s. And I mean, in the late 1990s. And do I think that pro wrestling, would be where it is right now without Hulk Hogan? And my answer to that is I don't think pro wrestling should be in the position it is right now. And there's a few reasons for that. The biggest reason for me is who is at the top of pro wrestling right now. John Cena, Cody Rhodes, Chris Jericho. I don't really follow it that well. All I saw was the main event for WrestleMania was on my preview screen of my smart TV for a while. It was John Cena versus Cody Rhodes. There are a lot of people right now in pro wrestling who are my age and older, or my age and younger, because I'm 52 years old, and so I would figure that a lot of people in pro wrestling right now who are younger than me, even in their 40s, they know a lot of things about wrestling that they won't ever talk about. And they know a lot of things that have happened behind the scenes that they won't talk about. Occasionally we get to hear them. I mean, we were hearing them, like for me anyway, we were hearing them as far back as the Nancy Argentino cover-up involving Jimmy Snuka and Vince McMahon and all of his cronies. We knew as far back as that pro wrestling was a scummy business. And it could have used a union. And it could have used something that would give it oversight. And it could have used something that would give the employees a lot more power. But it didn't do that. And a lot of it is because of Hulk Hogan. It was because so many people were paying to see him. So many people were paying to see the company that he worked for. He and Vince McMahon, were going to make sure that wrestling stayed the status quo. Over time, it came out a lot about how scummy pro wrestling is. Steroids and self-harm and wrestlers unaliving themselves and wrestlers dying before the age of 40, including many that I had actually known watching every week, going to Stampede wrestling shows. It was never going to be anything that you would get any respect for being a fan for. I don't think that pro wrestling fans should get respect. There is a lot of information available about how pro wrestling destroys bodies, it destroys minds, it destroys lives, it feeds to the lowest common denominator of our beings, our instincts as people, it was never something that you were going to get respect for. And there's a reason for that. For me, the turning point came with Nancy and Daniel Benoit. And the fact that if you were a wrestling fan back then, as I was, you were not going to get sympathy from anybody. That this part of your life that you had invested a great deal of time, money, energy into had been exposed as something so vile. No one at the time was going to take me aside and say, okay, I know how awful this must be for you. I would say Hulk Hogan had a lot to do with that. He made it so that in wrestling, you were only going to be successful if you looked out for yourself. Right at the very top, there was always a locker room. You were always going to have to take care of your opponent in the ring. You were always going to have to make sure that everyone that you worked with in a certain company or on a certain touring group, on a certain pro wrestling card was taken care of so that people would come and see the show. They would pay to come and see the show. Of course, there were lots of wrestlers like that. But in the end, the only way to really become successful at anything remotely approaching Hulk Hogan's level was to look out for yourself at the expense of others. For the longest time, what did happen was that we had a few wrestlers at the very, very top who looked out for themselves at the expense of others. Wrestling became something that I would say embodied the worst of capitalism without anyone really pointing it out or saying so or wanting to do something about it. As you can see, this is very emotional for me because I know lives have been destroyed because of the business that pro wrestling really is. There's no union. There's no real way for wrestlers to rightfully become part of, say, the Screen Actors Guild or something like that. Right now there isn't anyway. I did try to watch it about a week ago. And one of my favorite events used to be the Royal Rumble. So I turned on the last Royal Rumble. And the first thing I saw was Stephanie McMahon. And one of my conditions for watching wrestling again is that I don't see any of the McMahons ever again. And I thought I wouldn't, but turns out they're still characters, performers, celebrities in wrestling. And so that's it. I don't think that being a fan of what pro wrestling is enough for me to turn off my morality. I want Chris Jericho to tell me what he really knows. I want him to be honest. I want more wrestlers to open up, even if it means turning on something that they like to do. That is the only way anything is going to change. Dwayne Johnson certainly isn't going to do it. I don't think John Cena is going to do it. The last long-term sort of contact I had with wrestling was reading John Moxley's book. And even then, I felt like there was something he was holding back on. There was something he wasn't being completely honest about. It's because this is something that you could put all of the evidence in front of somebody like John Moxley, and he will still say he wants to be a pro wrestler. And I can't accept that as a human being. Wants to live with a degree of a moral compass, or a moral compass at all. I tried to watch episodes of The Dark Side of the Ring. And while some of it is good about exposing what pro wrestling really is, they're still holding back. And I think they're still holding back because there is still that mafia mentality. If you really do tell the truth about what happens, that is it for you. You will not be able, well, you not only will be able to do it anymore, you will have lost a piece of yourself that you desperately held on to make a living and to want to have some sort of professional satisfaction in what you did or are still doing. How many of us who either don't like wrestling who were wrestling fans and aren't anymore, or who are wrestling fans and don't want to be wrestling fans. Like, let's say it's just part of your social media feed, it's part of your Netflix subscription. You watch it regardless of how you really feel about it. How many of us can't accept it either from people like Chris Jericho, who can't be honest? The simple fact of the matter is, just simply not watching it, well, that's great. I don't watch it. I watched this year's Royal Rumble for maybe 5 minutes until I saw Stephanie McMahon. And also that I saw Kevin Owens. I don't like Kevin Owens because someone, told him while he was wrestling at a house show to eat a salad or something. And then he told that guy his annual salary for the past year. I don't understand why we will pay to see people like that. To me, Kevin Owens' entire identity was revealed with that comment. Someone's fat shaming you, yes. But if you're being paid that amount of money, why don't you stay in character? Why doesn't it bounce off you? I couldn't understand why he fired back telling that person his annual salary. Well, I lost all respect for Kevin Owens. But also, I knew then that, there was something about being a pro wrestler that was so scummy that I couldn't go back to it ever. And no matter how hard I tried, even if I wanted to watch 3 minutes of a Kevin Owens match, why is that aspect of pro wrestling, which Hulk Hogan created or helped to create, especially with the help of Vince McMahon, why is that still around? Why do people want it to be around? Why do people pay for it to be around? I don't understand. There's not a lot to necessarily like about pro wrestling. From my perspective, I grew up knowing what it really was and knowing that there was a standard that pro wrestlers had about looking real in the ring. Now, because Hulk Hogan and Vince McMahon turned it into such a lucrative form of entertainment, along with you-know-who, the 45th and 47th President of the United States, who is a big part of WWE history that can't be erased, that you can't get around. There's that aspect of it too. So when it is so ingrained, when it is such a part of it, I would say fascism is such a part of pro wrestling. Why are people still fans? I don't think that it's important what anyone's theory is, and I don't think it's important to say that people enjoy it. I spent a lot of my life seriously enjoying it. I wanted to be a pro wrestler. Now I'm happy I wasn't. I never became a pro wrestler because I would have become a pro wrestler in my early 20s, around the time that ECW was sort of changing the way pro wrestling was being presented. So I probably avoided a lot of unprotected chair shots. I probably avoided a lot of unnecessary violence and blows to the head and concussions. And I probably avoided CTE by not becoming a pro wrestler. I could understand why you may like it in a sense, but when there are so many other things where you could scratch that itch, why is it that a business that doesn't provide health insurance for its employees, that is built on the deaths of Nancy Argentino, Nancy and Daniel Benoit, an entire generation of wrestlers who died before their 40th birthday, was built on sex trafficking scandals and so many other things. The racism, homophobia, transphobia, and toxicity of their fans. Why would you want that? It is fascist entertainment. MAGA, Trump's America, is very much an environment that pro wrestling can thrive in, where you abuse your body, where you get paid very little, where you get paid a lot if you're successful, but you have to be successful at the expense of others. Wrestlers who have died prematurely, so many other things that we don't know about. I would like wrestlers to be honest about what they're doing. Do they do it just because they can, and they do it just because they can get paid? That was my opinion about Kevin Owens when I saw that clip. It didn't move the needle about what I thought about pro wrestling, and it actually deepened my contempt for pro wrestling. And I'm saying all this because if you know my history, you know that is a monumental turnaround for me. Someone who would defend pro wrestling, someone who wanted to be a pro wrestler, someone who would write about it, write letters to the Observer, talk about it with friends who didn't like me talking about it. Someone, I'm referring to myself, who became honest about it. For me, anyway, knowing who Chris Benoit was and then became, I learned that no one was going to say, I'm very, very sorry that this happened to you. There's many other things too. Owen Hart. I didn't do it at the time, but I should have cut myself off from pro wrestling then and never looked back. That's why I say it's the biggest mistake of my life. I don't have, a way to evangelize it. I don't have anything I want to say to people who are pro wrestling fans. Don't have anything to say to anyone who would ask me, do you want to watch wrestling again? And what would it take to bring you back? What would it take for me to buy a t-shirt, to watch the program again, to pay for a ticket to go see a live show? Things like that. I don't have an answer because for me, the question isn't there. The question would be, why should I be a pro wrestling fan? And I have no answer to that because there is no answer. When I heard that Hulk Hogan died, I knew that it was because of things like the Gawker verdict and so many other things that not a lot of people were sympathetic. And I'm not sympathetic at all. Neither am I sympathetic to people who thought that he was something. At the time that he was at his most popular, it was very easy to know what pro wrestling really was. Very easy to find it out. And people would tell you. Your friends would tell you. Classmates would tell you. Family members would tell you. People on the street would tell you what pro wrestling really was. It was fake. If the worst thing about wrestling is that it's fake, I could live with that. Having been ringside, having been so close to as many Stampede wrestling rings, as many, sort of Stu Hart booked wrestling rings as I was, if that was the worst thing about wrestling, then I could have lived with that. But it turned out that pro wrestling was not fake, that the very real thing about it is that it is vile. The fact that it had to merge with UFC, with the company that has been made successful by someone who is now trying to make slapfighting successful, it doesn't surprise me that WWE couldn't get bought by one of the big companies that are currently the big multimedia conglomerates that are merging and that are always in the talks to merge to become even bigger, Paramount, Disney. It didn't surprise me that WWE couldn't have been bought by someone like that, because who wants to be associated with it? And it's not because it's fake. I didn't even know about the merger with UFC until, I would say, a couple of years after it happened, because at that time it was so far off my radar. And the only reason it got back on my radar was the Netflix deal, so I tried to watch it again and I couldn't. And I can't watch AEW. I want Chris Jericho to be honest. He has been behind the scenes so much. He has talked to so many pro wrestlers. He must have insight and knowledge that should change our entire view of pro wrestling. It should change it to become something completely different than it is now. But we all know he likes being a celebrity. We all know he likes being a rock star. We all know he likes continuing to wrestle regardless of how many reinventions he has to do of himself. I know Triple H will never be honest, but I want CM Punk, I want Phil Brooks to be honest. And they're never going to be honest. They're politicians. Wrestling is political. Everything is political, and pro wrestling very much fits that description. I think that being a pro wrestling fan is a red flag in my opinion. It means you're okay with fascism. It means you're okay with people hurting themselves for very little money. You know, wrestlers are never going to be part of SAG. There's never going to be a wrestler's strike, which there should be. And Hulk Hogan is still a part of that. His DNA is still in the system. You know, that's why I have no sympathy. That's why I can't even feel for people who know that he was a scumbag and feel sorry for themselves now because they wanted to be a real American when they were kids. I don't necessarily feel sympathy for that. This is my first video, and this is the topic I wanted to speak about. Having a channel on YouTube, you know, is hard work if you want to get viewers. But I don't know. I always wrestled with the idea of being a public figure. I still don't know if I want to be, but I thought that it would be helpful if my first topic was something that I could speak about very honestly. That is that for today. Thank you.